All right, just so we kind of keep it like straight and narrow.
Yep.
And so on. But I think it'll be very good. And I mean, really, it's going to be all about your family heritage, which I think to me is incredibly important because you bring just an incredible story, and I want to truly capture that for you. So if we can do that, that would be awesome. Amen. So, but putting E1 on the map, I mean, we can talk about that real quick. So
okay,
go ahead, brother.
So my Uncle Paul, he's unfortunately deceased also, he got on in 69, I think it was, in Boston. You ever hear Leo Stapleton?
Of course. Commish.
Right. So him and Leo Stapleton were basically best friends. Stapleton worked with my grandfather, my Uncle Paul's father, who's also Paul. And they all got along and et cetera, et cetera. So in the late 70s, early 80s, my Uncle Paul was part of something called Project Fires. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No.
I'm not even going to try to explain it. It's way too long. But anyway, Boston, was a poor city at the time. The apparatus was falling apart. They needed equipment. The city didn't have any money. So Commissioner Stapleton basically reached out to my Uncle Paul and was like, hey, what can you do? And he was at that point a lieutenant, ladder 13. Ladder 13 got disbanded. He went to ladder 17. And he ended up becoming the safety officer for the city, aside from being a line officer in the company. So he found E1. I don't know exactly how he ended up with them, but reached out to them and basically put the Ford cab-over E1 engines in Boston. You could put them in your back pocket. Then ladder 17 got the very first E1 rear mount single screw 110-foot stratosphere aerial that they were building with the low jack spread. So to field test it, ladder 17 went to every working fire in the city to see where they could put it. They probably didn't make it a half. I don't know. I was like 6 years old. But I remember as a kid, my Uncle Paul being in my parents' kitchen, so him and my father going over apparatus drawings and, what about this, what about that, because it was always a tiller town. They had, 2 Sutphen aerial towers at one point, but it was all tiller trucks. So E1 came out with the great extruded aluminum aerial product.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that underslung outrigger design, from what I'm told, was my Uncle Paul's design. So he got them on the map, and then he helped develop the prototype to the first pass device. Actually, I've got newspaper clippings of him wearing it. It's just a big metal square box with an on-off switch. The impact liners in the cars, leather helmets, he helped develop those. The Black & Decker Sunlance, which then became the Sunlance Survivor Light, did all the field testing for those. He'd bring them to the firehouse, have like 20 or 30 of them at a clip, freeze them, put them on the grill, go up to the top of the 110-foot aerial, throw them on the ground, drive over them, do whatever he could to try to break them and see what they could withstand, did all that. That was in the 80s.
So for everybody listening, we're talking with Jack Dewan from Baltimore City Fire, who comes from an incredible line of firefighters.
Yeah.
Bloodline. I mean, and so we had you on the podcast earlier. This is a little extra that we're doing now because the stories that have come out through our conversation and just getting to know you warrant so much more time with you. And so we want to talk about your family. So I want to jump right back in, but I just want to bring people up to speed on who we are, who we're talking to, and so on. So Jack, give us the little backstory. I mean, just your father, your uncles, brother. I mean,
so there's 10 firemen and 1 cop in our family bloodline. My great-grandfather, John Devine, which there was a whole name change,
right?
And whatever, got on Boston in 1900. He died active duty, not line of duty, as a captain in 40. I think it was 1944. I wasn't around, so I have no idea. But I think
pictures.
I do, and actually, they're all on my Instagram page. If you go on and creep that later, you can. I think most of them are all up there.
And there's an incredible YouTube video too about his family lineage and so on that I watched the other night, and I'll share that. We'll share that set. We'll share that in the posts and so on. But an incredible 30-something minute video.
Thank you.
About your family.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
I watched it twice. I was like, man, this is incredible. So, but go ahead.
The longest response in the ladder.
Yeah, right. Well, that was during the riots.
Yeah.
Yep. Can you hear me now? All right, good. So great grandfather got on in 1900, died in 44, still on the job. My grandfather, his brother Charlie, his brother Bill, both firemen. My father, my Uncle Bill, my Uncle Paul, my Uncle Gerard, my cousin Michael, and myself. And Michael, who's a city of Peabody fireman, Peabody borders Lynn. Lynn's, they call it the North Shore. It's up north of Boston. Michael's father was the cop. And I don't know if you're big movie buffs or not. You've seen the movie Black Mass. It's
Yes.
about Whitey
Yeah.
Bulger. So my Uncle Frank, sergeant detective in Boston, was essentially hot on the trail of Whitey for years and years and years. Had all the wiretaps, had all of the information to pinch Whitey all the time. But Whitey was a protected FBI informant, so it never stuck. And one of the most honorable cops the Boston police ever had the privilege to have. And there's a whole other story on that side of it, just from my Uncle Frank, he's going to be 80, and he actually ran a 9/11 5K last year at
Wow. That's
awesome.
79 years old. Tough as nails and a total sweetheart gentleman of a human being. But so the rest of the firemen in the family, like I said, my great uncles Charlie and Bill, then my grandfather, and then as it went along down the line, Billy and Paul, who are my regular uncles, and Gerard, who's in New York City. We kind of talked about how that kind of transpired. Excuse me.
But most of your family, I mean, you're rooted in Boston.
Yeah.
So a lot of them were
Yeah.
in the Boston area,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
But a few of you have ventured outside.
Right. So, all native Bostonians, even my great-grandfather, he was first generation born in the U.S., so he was a native of Boston. And then, over time, as there were, political agendas and whatnot, my uncle and myself both couldn't get hired, so we ventured out.
Right.
So Gerard ended up in New York City, got hired first class in 96. He bounced around. He was in 217 engine. On the rotation, he went to 293. He was at ladder 11. He went to squad 41 on a skin. He was up there for a while. And us Dewans, we're kind of crazy. Like, we like to see everything. We can't just stay in one place. So he went to 35 Truck in Manhattan for a short time. And when he was there, he met Patty Brown.
Right.
And Patty Brown invited him to go to ladder 3. And when Patty Brown asks you to do something, you do it.
Wow.
So he went to ladder 3 and became great friends with Patty. And they were in different groups because the vacancy wasn't in Patty's group at that time. So, with guys transferring or retiring or however the vacancies occurred, the official first tour together in the same group was on 9/11.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
They would hang out and everything, all summer long. And, there was all sorts of stories that had come out that, we don't have enough time in the day to go over all of them.
Yeah.
But, there's guys out there like Tim Brown and Chris Brown who run the Bravest.com.
Mhm.
They were friends with Gerard and friends with Patty. And Tim and this other guy, Steve Gonzalez from ladder 3, were the guys who actually identified Gerard
Right.
at the morgue after they recovered him the first time,
Wow.
because he was recovered more than once.
Wow.
So the
I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
where we're headed, right? We were talking about this off camera, and I wanted to get back on camera with you with
Sure.
this because, such a family and such a bloodline and so on, and the fact that your family has had tragedy,
Yeah.
and you have a line of duty death of September 11th for your uncle Gerard. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, maybe
Yeah.
that experience,
Sure.
and so on, because I think so much comes out of it in so many different ways, when we talk about experiences like this. And I know just in this room alone, I have, testament memorial to Dana Hannon, who was on 26 engine that day, originally from 34 truck, but he was on his, rotation schedule. And so, he happened to be on 26 engine that day. And being on 26, which makes it a real small world, which you and I were talking about before, another gentleman by the name of Paul Tegmeyer
Yep.
was riding 26 that day with Dana. I don't think they knew each other. I knew both of them, which is interesting. Paul comes from the Poughkeepsie Hyde Park area up in New York where Rob is.
Yep.
And his name was highly spoken by all the guys up in that area, and so on. So it was just an interesting story for me to know that two gentlemen that I know and that were highly regarded by people that I respect were together that day.
Yeah.
And I just, it's stories like that we talk about quite often here when we talk about 9/11. I think people outside of the Northeast are a little more removed from it than all of us. We witnessed it, we saw it, we lived it. We know people that were, their lives changed and greatly impacted from that day. And it was a long time ago, but it still feels like yesterday type of thing.
I mean, for those of us who are intimately involved with it,
Yeah.
not necessarily on scene, but who experienced it the way we did, you really can't describe it. I mean, I was 20. I was just turning 22 when that happened. I had 4 years in the fire department. Life was good, essentially.
Sure.
And I was actually working EMS that day when AMR was huge, when they had like taken over the world. And I was working in the city of Milford, Massachusetts. And it was a normal day tour. And it was kind of weird. I was working with this guy, Greg Boucher, which I haven't seen or heard from in 15 years. I hope he's doing well. But we were leaving Milford Hospital, and we were listening to 94.1, which is a Providence radio station. AC/DC was playing. Why I remember this, I have no idea, but I do. So his cell phone rang, and I could hear his wife screaming through the phone. I'm like, what's her problem?
Yeah.
He's like, I don't know. I'm like, oh. He goes, like a helicopter or a plane or something crashed into the World Trade Center. And I'm like, Boston and New York. He's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, the Boston World Trade Center is directly across the harbor from Logan Airport. I used to work as a deckhand on the Spirit of Boston there years ago. I was like, probably wiped out all my friends. He's like, oh, I don't know. And she's like, no, the one in New York City. I'm like, well, there's two. They're like 110 stories tall. And, growing up in a fire department family, if you're a buff, everybody knows about the World Trade Center. So I was like, oh, wow. I'm like, I got to see this. So back to quarters, back the ambulance in, walk into the day room, and I don't know, however many minutes later it was, walk into the TV room, and the second plane was hitting. And I'm like, ugh. I was like, this is not an accident.
Right.
And my father worked his 24 the day before, and he was working his part-time job as a concierge at this luxury apartment building complex in Brookline. And there was no TVs where he was, and everybody had those info pages like we were talking about before. Right. And all the crazy texts, half of it was true. Who didn't know what was going on, whatever. Yeah. So, trying to make phone calls, all circuits are busy now. All circuits are busy now. And it's like, I want to make a phone call. Not realizing you can see what's going on the TV, but you didn't really understand the magnitude of what was going on because I'm in Massachusetts. This has happened, 200 miles south in Manhattan.
Yeah.
And so I finally get through to him, Dad, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. He goes, all I have is the pager. I'm trying to make phone calls. I was like, well, is Gerard working? He's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And I knew he was in Manhattan because I knew he was at Ladder 3.
Yeah, right.
And so they're probably operating. Obviously they're not going to answer the phone. So he kept trying to call the firehouse. There was no one there. Finally, there was a relocator that was in there. I think it was 59 truck, and they were there for a while. They had no idea what was going on, and it's not their fault. I mean, the whole world's coming to an end as far as we know. So I'm trying to think how this went. So it worked that tour. AMR actually mobilized a bunch of the ambulances, and my ambulance did not get sent, and I was furious. I'm like wearing a noticeable depression on the floor, walking circles around after both towers come down, and we know what's going on, even though you really have no idea. So the following day, I did a day tour in the firehouse in Dudley, where I'm still up there, and so that was Wednesday. So Thursday on the 13th. My father, my Uncle Bill, who was a Boston fireman, he was a lieutenant at the time in Engine 10 downtown, him, my old roommate, Andy DeLisio, who's a Providence fireman, we all got in our cars and we drove to New York. So we started at the apartment where Gerard lived, and Sean Cummins, who we had mentioned in the previous section, he was still at Squad 1 at the time. And we went to the house on 125th Street, and Sean kind of gave us a breakdown of what was going on. The dark stuff that, doesn't usually make it to the newsreels. Right. And he's like, so what you guys need to do is I'll unlock downstairs and go downstairs, get his toothbrush, get a hairbrush, pair of underwear, put in a Ziploc bag, mark it, Dewan, Gerard P., Division 1, Battalion 6, Ladder 3, and then bring it to the firehouse. Because we have no idea where anybody is, if we'll ever find them. They could be vaporized. They could be splintered. We have no idea. So as this becomes a prolonged operation, this is going to go on for God knows how long. If they find something, they'll check DNA. We were like, and this was 2 days later. That type of information was already being disseminated. It's like, wow. So, that was a huge,
I mean, I just remember from an outsider looking in, there was still that hope that, in the collapse and in the rubble, we were going to be finding people.
In the good void.
Yeah, and so on. But, when you look at, in retrospect, you look at the damage that was done, and when everything's powder. I mean, all I remember that day was the dust and the paper. Mm-hmm. There was paper, right? And that was being paperless, right? Yeah. So there was... I mean, it snowed paper for 3 days. I mean, it was just, it was like a New York City ticker tape. I mean, it was crazy.
I remember stuff like landing in Brooklyn. I think that like I saw a video at one point, and like paper was still smoldering, like that, and they were like, I was just like, wow.
It was incredible. I mean, incredibly impactful. So, you made the trip down. You gather his belongings. Now I'm sure you're trying to get across and into.
So we went. It was easy getting into Queens because it's not the city as a native New Yorker will call it. So then we left Rockaway and went up, Beach Channel Drive to Cross Bay Boulevard, going through like Woodhaven and everything, and going up to try to get to Queens Boulevard to go over I think we went over the 59th Street Bridge. And it took us almost 5 hours to get from Rockaway to the firehouse, and Ladder 3 is on 13th Street between 3rd and 4th.
Yeah.
And took us forever to get there. 59 truck was still relocated there. And I'll never forget, and, even though I had the connection with New York City, I didn't work there at the time, and I didn't understand some of the culture there because, again, I didn't work there. I knew my uncle was there, and we all hear stories about how things go in the firehouse and whatnot. Right. And complete zombies. And rightfully so. These guys were going through stuff that no one had ever imagined before. No. And, trying to put yourself into that situation, how would you feel if all of a sudden all these unknowns, relatives, stop walking up? Hey, have you seen my family? Hey, have you seen my family? I don't know how I would handle that, so there was that whole personal element of it, aside from operational stuff, that they're still responding to runs. They're still in and out, taking class 3s and, whatever else. So they still have to do their job in addition to dealing with all of us coming in, red-eyed and not knowing what to do. So we were there, I don't even know how many hours. And then it was nightfall. We ended up at Union Square where they had a billion candles and, moment of silence, all this other stuff that was going on. And so we stayed and ended up, I'm trying to think of how this went, which usually I have no problem telling the story, but for some reason I'm having a block. So we go back to Massachusetts and we go back and forth a bunch of different times and, trying to figure out, are there things being found? Are they not being found? Is there paperwork? Now, I was only 22, so I didn't have a total administrative involvement in much of this.
Right.
There were family meetings that I didn't have to go to because, quite frankly, I was 22 years old, working 2 full-time jobs and living 40 minutes away from the rest of the family. I had my own stuff I had to take care of in addition to, whatever my father would tell me.
Of course.
Because it wasn't my place to be making any decisions. I was a nephew. Still blood, but I'm not crucial to the operation. So, family would do whatever the family was doing, and, I would hear what was going on, and that was that. Well, we decided that we didn't know if he would ever be found because, let's face it, there were tons of people who weren't. And, excuse me, so we had the original memorial service, October 27th of 2001, no body.
Yeah.
So it was just, visitation, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that was essentially the big one. And if you ever read Leo Stapleton's book, DFC, there's a firefighter funeral on the cover. That's my uncle's funeral.
Is that right?
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Boston treated it as if it was one of their own because unfortunately, and we all know the stories now, there were 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 funerals a day. And, and like you heard guys talk about back then, if it wasn't for the out-of-town guys, they may have not had anybody there.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't stretch so many guys in so many places. It was, it's physically impossible.
Those are the stories that I don't think people outside of the area particularly understand.
Yeah.
Everything from what you were saying, you had firehouses that lost everyone working that day, and yet the guys that came in had to entertain the public, right? The public, there's big outpouring of support for the firehouses, right?
Right.
But they're dealing with their own grief, the grief of all the families and the general public.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't even imagine, right? And then on top of that, the realization that we went from a search and recovery to nobody's getting out of here alive type thing within 24 to 48 hours. That realization came out.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about thousands of people. And it's just, to me, if you outside of this area, I don't know how you digest that like we did here. For you, and where I want to go with this, Jack, is, you're a family of firefighters.
Right.
You've never had to deal with line of duty before, correct?
Right.
I mean,
Not in our family,
right?
no. Right.
So for you guys, I mean, all of you coming from the job and all of you being surrounded by people on the job, it had to be tough. I mean, it had, and I don't mean that, you know, I mean, you would think that like, oh, you guys would have to be more prepared and this and that, but I can't imagine.
Prepared.
No, I know. You understand what I'm getting at, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know how else to say it, but I mean, it's just, I'm interested to understand the dynamic of, I mean, I couldn't imagine. And so something of that scale, not only is it, you know, a horrible situation that you lose a member of your family in the line of duty, but when it's surrounded by such tragedy on a global scale, right? Yeah. I mean, that kind of just makes it even compounded even to
it
a bigger.
Was numbing.
Yeah.
Even now, I mean, it's, you know, 18 years later.
Right.
Yeah. And there's good days and bad days.
Yeah.
Like Gerard and I lived in the same room for 2 years when he was trying to get on. He drove a bus for the MBTA before he was able to get on in New York. And him and I shared my bedroom at my parents' house because my grandparents were deceased. The house got sold. You know, he needed a place to so he stayed with us. Yeah. So we were almost like brothers, even though he was my uncle. We were only 13 years apart. So it wasn't a terrible age
I get it.
So, you know, originally when it all happened, because we're in the fire department and the whole family is, I mean, prior to 9/11, every family function, every, you know, Christmas, it's, you know, oh yeah, your company's this, and oh, we took this fight, and it's all the typical like firehouse kitchen table in my kitchen, 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I mean, you're surrounded by
you know,
it, sure.
ball breaking, and my company's better than yours, and you guys suck, and all that type of stuff. So now it was all of a sudden it was a numbing effect because it's like, well, yeah, you know, it's a loved one and it's blood, but we still have that operational curiosity,
right?
And it's like, where do you draw the line? So you go to the firehouse. And it's like, yeah, you're looking for your loved one, but you want to know what was actually going on, but you don't want to ask that question because you don't want to cross a line, but you still have that, well, what happened?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because there's so many levels of curiosity. Where do you stop? Where's the line?
Well, I think too, you want answers that you know you can't get.
Right.
But something is better than nothing. And it's that I could only imagine the frustration and having to tackle that, walking in there and wanting an answer, like knowing, because you know what the answer is, but you want to, like, you know, and I think for me, like, I would want to know that they were, like, and obviously he was around the people who, you know, his brothers, but like, it's just,
you know,
you want to
know. At
what
what point, you know, it's like, we know later on from all the different things that have come about, you know, the phone call that Patty Brown made, you know, 3 truck, we're still headed up, you know, they were on like the 35th floor, they were working their way up. So you can kind of guesstimate, because he was in the North Tower. So you can kind of guesstimate as the building is coming down, watching the footage a billion times years later. You get to that point, there's the disconnection. Like you can kind of figure, it's a horrible thing to think about, but like, oh, okay, that must have been the point. You know what I mean?
I do.
It's, you know, there's so many other avenues of thought when it comes to what you're thinking about when it comes to that. Personally, emotionally, operationally, situationally, you know, he had the irons. Was he forcing the door? I don't know. We'll never know. You know, was he talking to somebody? Was he taking a hit off his mask? Who knows what they were doing? You know, we don't know. And those are all things that, you know, go through your mind. Yeah. Maybe not everybody's mind, but they go through my mind.
But they were doing what they love.
Right. And,
you know, I mean, that's the solace, right? Is that, you know, Nobody foresaw that day. Nobody foresaw what the outcome was going to be. Nobody could even fathom on a large scale how that day was going to play out. There's just no way. But
you know, and like there's questions that come out, and this was really strange. And I had mentioned before how he was found more than once. So the first time he was found was December 8th. C stairwell, North Tower, about the 40th floor, and the building came down. He was found 5 stories underground. So the way it was described, crudely, is that the first time they found him, they found from here to here.
Yeah.
Okay. A few other parts, but basically from there to there in both arms. And his left hand was severed, but they found it right next to him. And he was a marathon runner. Like, he was this guy, like, you could put him on a GQ magazine cover. Like, you know, every chick in the world wanted him because he was just that guy. You know, we're all jealous, right? So, so he had one of those really expensive Nike running watches. And when the coroner's office did their investigation, because they have to inventory things, like, I have the tools that were in his pockets, the channel locks, the screwdriver, the box keys. I have all of that. It's in a tin covered, and it's kind of funny. Well, it's not funny, but well, my father had them first, and they're in like a cookie tin, like those old blue, like your grandmother would have.
Right.
And he covered them in OxyClean because they stunk so bad. I mean, underground for, a couple of months, surrounded by death.
Yeah.
To try to get rid of the stench. So I now have them. They're still in the same brown paper bag, in the metal tin, in a hope chest, in a plastic bag. Like, they get unwrapped maybe once every couple of years. Someone, comes over and they want to see it and whatever. And next time I'm out this way, I'll try to bring them and I'll show you. But anyway, so the watch still had the time on it from when they took the picture on the Polaroid, and it, inventoried the stuff that was in his pockets. So then, kind of off the topic, but on the same topic, sorry, Tim Brown and Chris Brown, the guys who ran the Bravest.com, so Tim and Steve Gonzalez from Ladder 3 were the ones who identified him. So they had done it through dental records because they had his lower jaw. So they organized a police escort from the morgue in Manhattan to Boston.
Wow.
And it changed jurisdictional police agencies at every border. Wow. So NYPD to New York State to Connecticut State to Rhode Island State to Mass State to City of Boston. Oh, thank you very much. And then Chris, Tim's brother, who was a Providence fireman in the Special Hazards, as they were going through Rhode Island, he made whatever phone calls he made, and every bridge or every overpass had Providence companies on it.
Wow.
Which was amazing. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
But so then we knew. So on the 8th, they were recovered, and I say they, it was Gerard and David Fontana from Squad 1 were found together. And here's where I have a problem processing something, because I've spoken with Mark Gregory on several occasions. He was one of my uncle's best friends. And he's made mention that Pete, oh my God, I can't remember if he was a lieutenant in Rescue 2, Pete Martin, that Pete Martin was found with them also. And I've never asked him about it. And I'm going to have to call him and ask him, because something just isn't lining up in my brain. But anyway, so they get the police escort to Boston, and everyone in my family always goes to P.E. Murray Funeral Home. It's the same place they go to all the time. So we knew they were coming. So that was the 8th he was found, the 9th he was identified, the 10th he had the police escort. So the 10th that afternoon, early evening, they were all up there. So it was, Tim Brown and guys from Ladder 3 and, guys from all over the place. So get to the funeral home, and we're all, mulling around doing the normal funeral home stuff. And a maroon Chevy Astro van was what was carrying him, and he was still in the Stokes basket covering the American flag.
Wow.
And so, they've got the garage underneath, and they bring everything in. So we're all kind of like scattering because, nobody wants to be seen crying, and that's just how it is. We're all crazy like that. So I ended up walking into this room on the first floor of the funeral home, and I really didn't understand how the funeral homes operate, because that's not what I do for a living.
Right.
So all of a sudden, the floor starts to raise up, and it's just me and him. And I'm standing there in this room, I'm like jeans and a sweatshirt, because we just were there to bring him home. It wasn't the funeral service or anything. And so they lift him up, into the room, and there's the Stokes basket with him and the flag over it. And I was standing there going, and this is probably like a 15-second time span. Like, it takes longer to explain it than what actually happened. And I'm like, I want to look under the flag. Do I do it? Do I not do it? Do I do it? Do I not do it? And I didn't do it. And then I think it was Gonzo, Steve Gonzalez from Ladder 3 walks in. He always called me Junior because my father's Jack Dewan Sr.
Right.
And puts his arm around me. He's like, come on, Junior. You don't want to see that. You don't want to remember him like that.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. And, huge statement, subtly put, I get it. We walked out. That was that. And my cousin Michael, turns out, had a very similar event. And I'd have to confirm it with him, and I'm sure he'll fact check me when I talk to him later. He was downstairs and had a very similar, he was alone with him too.
Wow.
And he wanted to look and didn't, which is probably better for all of us. But so that was December of 2001. And then 2 years later, I had just been hired in New York City as a fire alarm dispatcher. And my aunt, my uncle's only sister, was in New York on a Massachusetts Families of 9/11 trip. They go and visit different places, and they go to the site, and met all sorts of people. And the very end, they went to the morgue and they met Dr. whomever it is, and he explained the process. And okay, Mrs. Donch, we've got remains for you. And okay, they get to my aunt, Mrs. Gilligan, we have remains for you. And she's like, oh no, we've already got him. He's already in the ground in Boston. And they were like, yeah, we've got more.
Yeah.
And what we didn't know, and it was not of anybody's fault, there was documents that were produced that either you wanted to be notified or you didn't. If you were notified, did you want the remains? And if they found more remains, did you want to be notified again? We didn't know any of that, so nothing ever got signed.
Right.
So they notified us because that's essentially what their process was. So we had the original memorial, October 27th of 01. Then we had the funeral 12/13 of 01, because then we had them, so we thought, we had some of them, put them in the ground. Then 2 years later, May of 03, had to do it again. He had, in Massachusetts, there's something called the concrete vault law. Once you're in, you're in. They had to get some sort of bill passed through the Massachusetts legislature somewhere. Wow. I don't even know how they do it, but they get them exhumed and then bring up the rest of the remains, put them back together essentially, and put them back in the ground again. So there's that.
Wow.
And what a wild, crazy.
I just think, we're sitting here and I'm thinking about it, and it's like it's reoccurring, right? Like, we talked about Black Friday Black Sunday, right? We've talked about all these different events in the fire service earlier on another show that we did with you, and so on. We talk about 9/11, and everybody had to relive this, and we constantly relive it.
Right.
Your uncle passed on one of the biggest days in American history.
Yeah.
And every single day, something is referred to that day, and it's always going to make you think about that day, and having to recover him on numerous occasions, and going through that process for your loved ones. Mm-hmm. That's tough, man. That's super tough.
I can tell you, there was at one point, one of the many times that I ended up at Ground Zero, I met this guy by the name of his nickname was Thule. He recently passed, I think, in the past 2 years. He was a senior guy. I want to say he was in 41 truck. Tall guy, salt and pepper blonde hair, mustache, and it's kind of funny. Old timer, and he was walking around with his leather helmet on, bless him, and only had a Proby insert. Like, he wasn't wearing a regular front, just had the Proby insert, and totally like a Joker type guy. And so he drove me around on a gator all around the site and explained to me what was going on. And, we went inside the tent house and showed me how the logistical operations was going in there as a depot for tools and equipment and clothing and everything else. And I was going to leave, and he brought me back over to where my truck was parked over, I think it was off of Rector Street. Anyway, so we go over there, and we're, conversing. And there was this loud crash. Apparently like a grappler, like a construction equipment, dropped an I-beam. It happens. It's a construction site at this point, And he's like, that reminds me. I said, what? He goes, something similar to that happens frequently. It is what it is. That happens in construction. And, everything's uneven. But he says, the first time I heard that, he goes, it made me think that whatever pain was suffered by civilian, firemen, police officer, whomever, when they met their match that day, that steel I-beam weighs God knows how many tons, no idea.
Right.
And it's instant squish, done.
Right.
It's like us stepping on an ant. 1 second you're here, 1 second you're not. So he goes, there was no suffering.
Right.
He goes, so think about that. As much as it's gruesome and there's all these different thoughts and everybody puts things in their head in their own way and has their own opinions, he goes, it was instant. There was no, you're laying in a bed with decubitus ulcers for 6 weeks,
right?
Right. Suffering from whatever. It was here today. Now you're not. And
what an incredible story, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, thank you, Jack. I mean, I think so often we shy away from conversation about this. I think so often in the fire service we're afraid to talk about this or open up about it. And and that's got its own issues too. The fact that you're willing to share these stories with us that affected your family, and I think it's a true testament to how in line you guys are with the fire service and how much you love this craft. And I thank you for being here with us and sharing that story about your uncle, Ladder 3, Gerard Dewan.
Yep.
Is it it's Dewan, right?
Dewan. Yep.
Dewan.
Yep.
Yeah.
As long as you don't call us late for dinner. We
Right.
don't
Yeah.
care.
I'm the same way, brother. I get it. But thank you for sharing that story with us. I'd like to think that putting out information like that and a story like that really gives people an understanding about the other side of what we do and what we deal with. And I thank you for that. And I think a lot of other people thank you for that as well. So
my privilege.
Yeah. So Jack, thank you. For Jack Dewan and the guys at National Fire Radio, a little extracurricular conversation, but thank you, brother. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Good. Thanks, guys. Take care.